Hello, everybody. My name is Sam Weeks. I am a full-time MBA admissions consultant, and I'm joined today by Nanako. Nanako is a new joiner to the Sam Weeks consulting team. Nanako, why don't you start off by just introducing yourself?
Yes, and thank you for having me. So by way of background, I'm originally from Japan. I kind of spent my childhood going back and forth between the US and Japan, but ultimately ended up in the US for college, where I went to a small liberal arts school in Southern California called Pomona College. But there I studied economics. Afterwards, I ended up in management consulting in New York, mostly working in the financial services sector. And it was kind of during my time there where I started to think a little bit more about going back to school. I had always been interested in going to do like an international development type program, and was looking at a number of master's programs in that realm. And actually, interestingly, I wasn't really thinking about MBAs at the time when I was in consulting. But as I was looking at these development programs, I realized like, actually, I don't have any relevant experience. And so I decided, well, I should actually go and move into, the field and actually do this work. And so I ended up in this small country called Swaziland, which is now called Eswatini, but it's a small landlocked country between Mozambique and South Africa. And there I was working with a public health NGO called the Clinton Health Access Initiative. So CHAI is kind of an entity that spun out from the Clinton Foundation quite some time back. But there I basically found myself, I was in this world of public health, had no background, but for me, the kind of the consulting toolkit of, kind of the analytical mind and kind of the way we approach problems was actually quite similar. So we were essentially helping, ministries of health in Southern Africa facilitate policy making for HIV and tuberculosis programming and other kind of big epidemics in the region. I spent, I ended up spending about 2 years there, eventually moved to Malawi afterwards, and realized like, I actually really love this work and, was fully committed to doing a development degree. But at the same time, I also saw kind of this world of business outside of my narrow consulting world that I had inhabited for my first years after college and realized, it's actually, there's a really powerful way to approach big public health issues, and that's by bringing, the private sector, and specifically a lot of the work that we were doing was negotiating with pharmaceutical companies on bringing down drug prices for developing countries. So there I was like, wow, this is so interesting, and I absolutely love this kind of public policy world, but I really think an MBA and kind of having like proper MBA training and getting that degree would be useful in my career. So I ended up, that's when I really started thinking about joint degrees and dual degrees. And so, initially I had applied to a number of different policy schools, but had it in my heart that I really wanted to go to the Kennedy School of Government. They have a program there called the Masters of Public Administration and International Development that really appealed to me. It's a very quantitative, econ heavy program. The kind of the first year curriculum is basically like a intro PhD level coursework on economics. So I applied there, but then I also applied to two other business schools, which was Harvard Business School and the Stanford Graduate School of Business. And in the end, I got into the Kennedy School. I actually didn't, I interviewed for both GSB and HBS and didn't get into either, but it was kind of a blessing in disguise in that I ended up, being able to spend a little bit more time in Africa. And then Kennedy School allowed me to defer my enrollment for a year, and that's when I actually reapplied to HBS and GSB, and then ended up getting into HBS and got accepted into the joint degree program. And so
Wow,
that's how I ended up at HBS and HKS.
fantastic. You're so happy when that happened. Um, so I think tell us about the application process that you went through then. So you applied once and then again, and so you went through the process plenty. Tell us about your application process and how you found it applying while working. Tell us about that.
Yeah, yeah. So for me, I knew that you know it was important for me to get into, I mean, both schools independently, right? Like that's how this joint degree application works. You get into both schools independently, and then there's kind of a joint degree team at both schools that, assesses your application as a joint degree candidate. So, for me, the most important thing was spending as much time as possible kind of reflecting and really thinking about what my narrative was going to be. And that actually, it can be a little bit painful while you're writing these essays and thinking this through, but at the end of the day, I think that paid dividends when I actually started school because having a lot more clarity on what I wanted to do really helped me focus during my time in graduate school. But um, when I first applied, so I applied round two to GSB and HBS. And, I'd only spent a few months in Africa at the time. And, I knew my recommenders. One of my recommenders was from my time in consulting. So, he knew me really well. But my manager in Swaziland, had only worked with me for a few months. And I think, at the time, probably why I didn't get in. I mean, I'm sure there are a number of different factors, but my suspicion was she probably didn't know me enough. And perhaps, the letter recommendation was a little bit weak, and overall that kind of weakened the overall application package. So I had some time to kind of, once I got the rejection, obviously that's never fun, but, I had some time to reflect and really think about, how else I can strengthen my application. And I actually ended up reapplying in round one, which, as some of know, the timeline between round two and round one is quite short. During that time, I did not change jobs. I just continued to, my work in Swaziland. But I do think I developed a really close relationship with my supervisor, and she basically wrote me a second recommendation letter for that, following year round one application. And actually, after I got accepted, she showed it to me, and I realized that was really kind of it.
Wow.
She wrote this amazing letter that pulled all my application, different application pieces together, and yeah, so I think it was just, really making sure to take time to think about, what went wrong, maybe what else can I strengthen? What other things can I do to increase my chances of getting in? And I think that, actually having a bit of a lag was helpful for me.
Yeah. So there's a couple of points there. Let's just pick these apart. One of them is you applied as a reapplicant from round two 1 year to round one the following year. Really, really small gap. So you applied in the Jan deadline and then the September deadline. So you've had 9 months to improve your profile. And the second thing you said then is that you think the main difference between those two applications was your letter of recommendation improving. Was there anything else you think
Yes.
improved?
Yeah, I mean, I think my essays as well, I'd only spent a few months in Africa at the time, and, my narrative changed a little bit. In my second application, I wrote a lot about, and this is, what I ended up really focusing on graduate school, which was, by the time the second application rolled around, I had done enough work to really see the power of, donors and philanthropy funding the work, the important, public health work I was doing, but also the risk of donor dependency. And for example, when I was working in Malawi, I mean, basically their entire health system is funded by donors. And when certain macro events happen in the world, when financial crises happen, there's a real drop in, a lot of the work that we were doing and the efficacy of that. And so, I felt like I kind of lived through that a little bit more, and felt like, in my essay, the second time around, I was able to write that kind of in much more detail. And also in my interview, I was able to really talk confidently about what I had seen and why I think, I wanted to go back to school to understand these issues and improve, work on this issue after school.
I've got a question for you, Nanako, and if you don't have the answer to this, fine, but intuitively. You said before that as you apply to a JD, a joint degree program, you have to apply independently and be admitted to independently both schools. Initially, you would think statistically your chances, therefore, of getting admitted into a JD are lower because it's you have to get admitted to both. In my experience, though, applicants who are well suited to a joint degree program, actually it benefits them because they have twice as much real estate to write about their experience. They get to write 2 applications plus the additional essays, etc. What do you think is the strategic route, the highest likelihood route of getting into Harvard? If I'm agnostic to which program or whatever, I just want to get into Harvard. What do you think is the strategy?
That is a great question. Yeah, I mean, I guess there are definitely 2 ways to see this, right? One, as you said, it's just like having to get into 2 schools that have already very low acceptance rates, makes this, seem like an impossible task. But at the same time, there are certain people with backgrounds who, kind of really lend themselves to a joint degree curriculum and that experience.
There's also fewer
Yeah.
applicants, I imagine, applying to JD programs. So actually, maybe the statistics. I'd love to see the odds on that. I'd love to see the number of admits versus the number of applicants. Do you have any sense for those numbers?
Uh, I don't, but actually you'd be surprised to see, so joint degrees are increasingly becoming quite popular. So when I asked the average person at HBS if they applied to a joint degree, they said no, like I wanted to do an MBA and that's why I'm here. When I was at the Kennedy School, actually, the average person I spoke to said I had applied for a joint or a dual degree and I've gotten in or didn't, and I opted to just do HKS or have another business school that I'm doing this with. And it's just not just the Kennedy School. Like at HBS, for example, I had classmates who were doing joint degrees with the law school, with the medical school. Harvard started a new program a few years ago. There's a master's in engineering, and that's a joint with HBS. So that's increasingly popular at the Kennedy School too. Public health degrees, law degrees, med degrees, like it's like every possible combination you can think of existed at just the two schools I was at. If you think about the broader set of Harvard schools, I think there's even more. So yeah, I mean, I don't, I'd like to think that it's really difficult to get into these schools, but maybe it actually is a strategy to try to apply to multiple schools and kind of, present yourself as this is how I'm unique, this is how I differentiate myself. I'm going to specialize in these two different fields. So yes, that is a great question that I don't have a good answer to.
So good. Okay, now so you applied, you got admitted eventually after in the second attempt. Um, you got into both. Now, what I'd like to do, I'd like to ask you, what were three interesting things about the joint degree program, the HBS HKS experience, that somebody from the outside might not be aware of?
Yeah. So the first one is, kind of distinguishing between a joint degree versus a dual degree. I think we tend to throw these terms around interchangeably. I mean, I certainly did until I actually joined this joint degree program. But, um, if you think about doing 2 degrees at any other schools, right? And for example, so the Kennedy School only allows MBA duals with a handful of schools. So, I mean, HBS, that's considered like the joint degree. It's like this jointly integrated curriculum, programming, staff, faculty, etc. And then you can do that with MIT Sloan, Dartmouth Tuck, and Wharton. Those were the schools that were allowed during my time there. Perhaps that has changed. But if you do, and sorry, Stanford. So if you do an MBA at the schools outside of Harvard and Kennedy, I mean, you're basically on your own. You're spending a year and a half at each school. And there's no one to tell you what to do. You're kind of just going back and forth between the two schools, and there are certain set of classmates that are having the same experience as you, so that's kind of your shared experience that you'll have. But otherwise, very independent, separate. These tools, Stanford's not going to talk to the Kennedy School for the most part. Versus if you do the Harvard Business School, Harvard Kennedy School joint degree program, over the course of 3 years, I mean, you're part of both schools for the entire period. So from thinking about just the academic curriculum, so for all 3 years, you have the joint degree seminar, which, so usually there are about 25 to 30 students who do the joint degree program, but you're basically with this cohort for 3 years, which makes for like a really intimate, amazing bonding experience. And you're spending like all your semesters like doing this the joint degree seminar and kind of doing all the academic curriculum with these with your classmates. Secondly, so the joint degree program has, so the Kennedy School has something called the Center for Public Leadership, and so they have a number of different research institutions affiliated with the school, but the CPL, the Center for Public Leadership, they have a scholarship specific for HBS, HKS joint degree students, and they offer a ton of different programming around like leadership experiences, and a lot of kind of offsites and retreats and dinners where they bring speakers, and they have this like whole catered experience just for joint degree students. So that's, at the end of the day, like if you can get into the HBS HKS program, it's just like there's a whole team looking out for you. You are kind of in that world for 3 years, versus if you did like a Stanford and Kennedy or MIT and Kennedy, kind of those are two separate and independent worlds. So that's the first point. The second point is, so interestingly enough, for me, doing the HBS HKS degree was actually cheaper than doing HKS separately or HBS separately. And this isn't thinking about, the opportunity cost of not working that third year, but if you can get into this joint degree program, the Center for Public Leadership has this scholarship called the Rubenstein Fellowship, which was started by David Rubenstein, who some of you may know, founded the Carlyle Group. But he essentially wanted to create this scholarship where, your first, at least when I was there, this may have changed, but when I was there, my first year was completely free. And he basically wanted to make the investment into a 3-year program the same as a 2-year program. So my first year, I had a full ride, very generous, very, very grateful. I had a, summer, um, I had summer funding for an internship, so I could just go and do whatever, unpaid thing I could find. And, the Rubenstein Fellowship paid for that. And then my second year at HBS, HBS is one of the few schools that does need-based funding. I had not worked the previous year because I was at the Kennedy School. This is my first year of the joint degree. You spent it at the Kennedy School the first year, second year at HBS, and the third year is kind of split across both schools. But that first year when, all my other MBA classmates were working, I was not working when I started my first year at HBS. So between having a nonprofit job and just not having a ton of savings, HBS, again, extremely generous, basically offered me a close to full ride. And that summer too, I wanted to do an unpaid internship. HBS has a ton of funding available for that. So my summer, I ended up having savings from doing this unpaid internship due to the funding I got from HBS. And then the third year, again through the Center for Public Leadership at the Kennedy School, there was a fellowship specific to joint degree students, and that paid for like I think about half of my tuition. And then that last semester at HBS, again, through the HBS financial aid, I got, most of that covered. So, I guess the myth I'm trying to bust here is that people hear 3 years and they think, oh my God, that's so expensive. MBA is already expensive enough. Can't imagine adding another year. But actually, this joint degree program makes it extremely affordable and accessible. And at the end of the day, if you can get into HBS, like they will, find a way to fund your studies. And then lastly, about the joint degree program, I mean, so 3 years, outside of what I just talked about on the financial aid side, I mean, 3 years is amazing. I mean, when I started, and this is something I talk, a lot about with people who are debating, do I do a joint, dual, or just a single MBA degree? 3 years sounds like a lot, but maybe it's because I'm have been out of it for quite some time. But one, it was like a total blip, and it's just so nice to have 2 summers to really think about what you want to do. And some people are really ambitious and end up doing 4 internships over 2 summers because they're really just trying to test all the different hypotheses they developed during grad school and trying to narrow down their choices on what they want to do after graduating. But I just can't emphasize enough, like having 3 years is just like such a luxury. And between having all this funding for internships or doing independent projects outside of school, like there's just so many resources available, so you can just maximize your experience and just explore every corner of the universe that you're interested in to help you narrow down your choices after graduating.
It's absolutely phenomenal, isn't it? It's so, so good. I'm trying to imagine. I mean, mine was a 1-year MBA program, and I got a lot out of it. I'm trying to imagine how much you must have got out of a 3-year. That's just incredible. Were there times though where the two, how did the curriculum overlap? Were there times when the school's perspectives maybe clashed? Tell me about that.
Yeah, so to think about how they complemented each other. So, as many of you know, business schools tend to focus on, training that is very practical. It's very real world oriented. At HBS, especially, I mean, in the case method, I think you do like 200 cases, 250 cases per year, or something like this. And every case is about a real company, a real organization, a real issue. And the discussion is all about, as the protagonist, what would you do? What are the things you think about, et cetera. Versus at the Kennedy School, and I'll caveat what I'm about to say with the fact that, so the Kennedy School has a number of different programs. So for example, I did this MPA-ID program, which tends to be very econ, very quant heavy, versus a program like the MPP, the Masters in Public Policies, tends to be less of that. It tends to be a lot more qualitative in nature. It tends to be a little bit more domestic oriented. But but for my MPA-ID program, I actually started off the school year with like a 3-week math camp. So we all arrived early on campus before anyone else did. So it was just the MPA-IDs were redoing calculus, linear algebra, probability, statistics. And then, the core curriculum is just straight up micro, macro, statistics, econometrics, very theoretical, like all model-based thinking. So I think, being at the business school, which is very practical, versus at the Kennedy School in this MPAD, where it was very theory heavy, model heavy, it was good to be in both worlds, because, I could also see how being at one school versus other, like kind of, it's hard to like bring those two mindsets together. So, that was interesting. But I would also say that, for example, at the Kennedy School, like I did a ton of macro classes that were actually really helpful in my HBS curriculum. So in the HBS core, when I was there was a program called Biggie, which was like a big, kind of a economics, international business type class. And in Biggie, we like each case was like a country. And we are basically thinking about like, as the president, what would I do to solve this specific macroeconomic issue? And, kind of bringing in my Kennedy School training on macro was really, really helpful. Also in my Kennedy School program, we did a lot of like game theory, probability, and that stuff also was really helpful when we were talking about like climate change or, just other kind of big picture issues at HBS. So those were how, those very complementary. In terms of when there was a little bit of a clash, and I think this is probably the most interesting and compelling part of the joint degree, which is you get to straddle these two different worlds, for your whole 3 years. And it helps that the business school and the Kennedy School are just like literally across the river from each other. It's a 5-minute walk, you cross a bridge. The joint degree cohort, we'd always joke that we were like the bridge runners, because we're, running back and forth between classes. I think for me, the biggest difference I noticed was it was all about kind of like, what is your unit of analysis that you're thinking about at each school? So at the business school, your unit of analysis through the cases are like a business unit, a company. It's kind of at that level of thinking and like how you optimize decision making around that universe. Versus at the Kennedy School, public policy means you're thinking about cities, countries, the world, like different regions of the world. And just the level of optimization and like how to think about problems is just so different. I mean, it's much more macro, much harder in my mind, because you're thinking about so many different stakeholders. It's not just about, not to just talk about HBS cases of being simple about you're just maximizing profit. No, it's not just that, but there is just like a fundamental difference of, if you're a policymaker, the things and stakeholders you need to think about, versus if you're operating in an individual business unit or a company, the things you need to think about. So those were kind of straddling that world was really interesting. I guess some of the other, sorry.
Tell me, how are the people different?
The people, yeah, so they're very different, as you can imagine, but in a good way. At the Kennedy School, you walk around in the cafeteria and I would overhear conversations around some kind of obscure policy question, or about, some big macro topic that had come in the news, or some election that's happening in some country. And especially my MPA-ID curriculum, so there are actually only about 10% of the class was American, very international. And so just even in the classroom, just like the things you'd hear about, it's like, wow, like I had no idea this thing happened in this country that I just never really heard about or know anything about. Versus at the business school, it tends to be a lot more oriented around like, especially during like recruiting season, it's like, your interviews and kind of different companies one has networked with. And so, but there are also really interesting discussions that are happening around, other, like I was in grad school during the Trump election, my HBS class, like my professor, actually, she walked in the day after the election and she actually just canceled the case for the day. And she said, let's talk about what happened. And that was incredible. And I love that HBS gave us the space to talk about that in our section. So, but fundamentally, I do think, at the Kennedy School, people are very mission driven, very impact driven. Like they've come to school to solve a specific social problem, a specific market failure, or at least that's what they come in with interest, and then maybe their interests evolve over time. But that passion is there for some big societal problem that we're all trying to fix. So that just naturally results in slightly different conversations than you'd have at the business school. But all in all, I mean, I don't HBS was amazing. I mean, the academics are incredible. The professors are so well trained in how they do the case method and kind of opening your eyes up to different perspectives in the classroom. And so, yeah,
Can you
I
talk
mean,
about that
just
a bit?
yeah.
Because obviously HBS is well known for being very, very meticulously focused on the case method. Can you talk about, from your perspective, how was the case method and how did that differ
Mhm.
from the teaching style at HKS?
Yeah, very different. So the Kennedy School tended to be a lot more focused on lectures and, solving problem sets, a lot of homework, a lot of reading and writing, etc. HBS, the case method, I mean, I found it to be, it's quite intimidating at first. I mean, you're sitting in a classroom with 90 other brilliant, really smart people with, all sorts of different perspectives. And, there's a scribe in the back of the room taking note of who has spoken, who has said what. And it's on that basis that the professor will grade. Half of the grade is class participation. So if you're not there, if you're not talking, I mean, you will fail. And unfortunately, there are people who are asked to leave after their first year, at least to take a break because they just haven't performed in the classroom. But I loved it. I mean, it just really forces you to think about, an issue with, I mean, it really mimics the real world, right? So like there are no electronics in the classroom, no computers, they give you paper cases. If it's a finance class, you print out your Excel model and all the different tabs associated with it to walk through that model. So no distractions, but it just kind of feels like you're in this like huge boardroom where, yeah, I mean, you must speak up. Otherwise, there's a lot of cold calling, and you need to have an opinion, state it, defend it. Professors can grill you for up to 10 minutes if what you're saying doesn't make sense. And this is all being done in front of all your classmates, right? So it definitely took a while for me to get used to, but I think for me, the biggest thing I've taken away from my HBS experience is that kind of training is so invaluable. Like now, even, in the workplace, like I think about, how I'm speaking, when is the right time to intervene, how can I say something that is actually moving the conversation forward versus just speaking for the sake of speaking. So that kind of communication style is something that HBS really values, and also what they would look for in your interview, right? To be able to, they're trying to see if you can survive in the classroom with the case method, and
I
yeah.
wish
So I
more,
think that people,
I wish more people were thinking like that.
yeah.
Okay, brilliant. So tell me about your career in international development and how specifically the program has sort of fed into that and how you thought the program was going to help, how it actually ended up helping, and how that all fits together.
Yeah. So, going into the program, I knew I was going back to school to further my career in international development. I'd already been doing this public health work in Africa, loved it, wanted to be back in Africa. But, the reason why I went back to school was to really think about this question of like, okay, so all these countries are super donor dependent. How do we get them off that and make them more self-sufficient? So the kind of the narrative I had in my mind was, well, so for countries to be able to pay for their own health services, they need a tax base. There needs to be a private sector to fund this tax base. So that's why my interest was thinking about, how do we develop the private sector in Africa and other developing countries. So that was like the broad interest I came in with. I mean, I was very specific about, kind of about the healthcare sector, but knew that, my mind would change over the 3 years. So kind of was like, whatever sector it is, like this is the general interest I have. And I would say, my time in, so my first year at the Kennedy School in this MPA-ID curriculum, we did a lot of thinking about, there's something called the growth diagnostic you do on a country, but it's essentially like running all sorts of statistical analyses and running a bunch of regressions and trying to figure out like what are the binding constraints to a country's economic development. And we kind of did this over and over. And as I was doing this, I was like, wow, this is fascinating. Like infrastructure is something, access to finance and infrastructure were kind of the key constraints that I would often see over and over. And so, after my first year at the Kennedy School, the internship I decided to do was to work in the Rwandan government, whose mandate was to facilitate private investment into the country. So I wanted to put on my government hat after a year of HKS, but then to help think through and like interact with the private sector in Rwanda of like, what are the constraints to doing more investing, private sector investing in the country. So that was kind of my interest my first year. And then my second year at HBS, I got really involved with, and my favorite part of HBS was the Africa Business Club. And so, out of all the different student groups that exist at HBS, the ABC Africa Business Club was something that really spoke to me. And it was just kind of, a lot of African nationals and random people like me who, had done some work in Africa. And through that, every year we hosted this big Africa Business Conference, and being an organizer of that, you get to kind of invite speakers that you want to network with and hear about careers through that. And between that, and then I also had a number of friends who had done some private equity in Africa. And so I was like, okay, this is really interesting. I'd love to put on my MBA hat for the summer and go into like an actual investment role. And so I ended up doing a private equity internship in Ethiopia. And that was like a really eye-opening experience for me. And I kind of decided ultimately that's kind of the route I want to go. But the main sticking point was, if you're doing PE in Africa, one could argue any monetary amount you're putting into these countries is quote unquote impact. But I wanted to be in an organization that had more rigor and discipline around how you define impact, how you talk about impact. And, the PE firm I was working with in Africa, their LPs were development finance institutions. So they're also interested in that. But I felt like that impact conversation wasn't front and center in the way that I wanted it to be. So in my third year of my joint degree, I started doing a lot more networking and realized like, okay, so the International Finance Corporation, IFC, which is part of the World Bank Group, kind of fit everything that I wanted, which was like commercially driven institution, but really thinks about this double bottom line, like thinks really hard about social impact and environmental impact. And if there's an issue on either, on the environmental social side that just isn't going to work, like we just don't invest. Like it's not just the commercial returns that, IFC looks at. So so, it was kind of through my 2 summers, my 2 years of HBS, HKS, and my third year thinking like, okay, this is really what I wanted to do. And that's how I ended up at IFC after graduating.
Fantastic. And so, now as an admissions consultant, who are the groups of students that you vibe with best?
Yeah. I mean, I vibe with anyone who is interested in an MBA because that's the experience I had. But I would say that, I particularly love working with, people who are interested in joint degrees. And it doesn't have to be, HBS, public policy school. It could be, really any joint degree. Certainly, I mean, I can speak to the public policy experience the most, but yeah, and I think there's like a really niche world that you would inhabit if you get into these programs. And yeah, I mean, I would love to work with people who are interested in that, world and get them in and be able to, use my experience for that purpose.
I feel like people with non-profit careers as well probably is also a really good fit, right?
Absolutely. Nonprofit careers, any kind of like international development type career. I mean, government careers. I mean, I've never worked in US government, but, I um, have public sector experience in other countries that hopefully is also relevant. So yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so then last question from me is, what one point of advice would you give to somebody who's you 5 years ago, or a couple of years before you embark on this educational marathon?
Yes. My one piece of advice is, I mean, try to talk to as many people as possible who've actually done this joint degree program or like a dual degree combination that you're interested in, because there's just so much information and experience that just can't be shared without having a call. And for me, I had so many conversations like that, and that's ultimately what kind of was the distilling factor of thinking through like, okay, this is what I really want to do. So yeah, just network. I know it's hard, but cold email people, I did a ton of that, and most people didn't respond. Some people did, and those conversations I had were really helpful. And I know this may be hard for international students, but if you can, I also really encourage you to go to campus, sit in on a class, because that is also probably the best way for you to figure out if a school is a good fit for you. Because this degree might sound appealing, but if you end up sitting in a class at Harvard and you're like, oh my gosh, this case method, like this just doesn't work for me. Like I know it doesn't work for everyone. You probably want to look at, don't waste your time applying to HBS, go apply somewhere else. And I think there are also a bunch of YouTube videos you can watch to kind of get that classroom experience, at least on the HBS side. HKS may have that too, but yeah. So I'd also encourage you to just really try to experience that as an applicant.
And to build on that, if we're being cynical slash pragmatic, visiting can also be very useful, perhaps in your essays, perhaps in your interview experience as well. Mentioning that you visited is also not a bad thing either.
Absolutely.
All right. Fantastic. Well, Nanako, you've laid up my final ending, which is if you would like to speak to someone who has been through this experience, Nanako is available. You can book a call with Nanako via the Sam Weeks website. So go to samweeks.com. Top corner, there's a schedule a chat link. Click on that link and you can meet Nanako for free for half an hour or so to discuss your plans, your profile, and whether MBA/joint degree admissions consulting is for you. So on that note, Nanako, thank you so much for taking your time this afternoon to answer my barrage of questions. Really, really appreciate it. And yeah, looking forward to another successful round of applications in round 2.
Great. Yeah. Same here as well. Thanks so much, Sam.
Take care. Bye.